Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Future Net Zero Insight with me, Kieran Bowes. And I'm delighted to say this week that I'm joined by Dr. Darian McBain, who's joining us all the way from Singapore, here to talk about a really interesting subject called the blue economy. But before we get into that, would you mind just explaining to people watching a bit about yourself and maybe some context on the research you're doing at the moment?
Hi, Kieran. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me on to have this discussion. So I have been working in the blue economy for many years. Before my current role, I used to work with Thai Union, who is one of the largest seafood processors in the world. And although the name says Thai, actually it's a global company. So the sourcing of fish came from both the water and on land when you look at aquaculture, but from all different oceans and seas. And then the distribution of products was to all different countries. And so when you're working in any of the ocean or blue economy countries and companies, then you start to think about how everything is really very interrelated. So although we were working in fishing, obviously the impacts of, say, maritime shipping or deep sea mining or tourism would have to be taken into account. And so I've really been starting to look at how do we consider the blue economy as a whole, and what will be the impact if we start to take some integrated planning approaches?
I guess really to sort of kick us off, can you actually tell us more about the concept of a blue economy? How does it differ from a green economy, which a lot of people may be more familiar with?
So the ocean economy, if you look at it as its different components, is worth around $1.5 trillion. Or if you look at just one section of that, maritime shipping, 90+% of everything is sent by ocean transport. So it's really important. So there's main components. So there's maritime shipping. There is ocean foods or blue foods, which is mainly seafood and aquaculture, so wild capture and aquaculture. You have tourism, which is coastal-based tourism. You can have things like renewable energy, so offshore renewable energy. There is mining, there is cabling, and then there are marine resources and the genetic materials that we're finding from the oceans. So there are a lot of the key categories that when you put them all together, make up the blue economy. And then you've got all of the people who work in that economy, and of course the interactions that you have with the land. So how is it different? Obviously, the concepts are the same, and certainly when you're looking at financing, it's the same, but you do need to understand, I guess, the risks and the opportunities. And to do that, you need good quality data. And actually, there's a lack of data and understanding on the oceans. And when we look at, let's say, carbon credits and carbon offsets, perhaps, or nature-based solutions, actually the oceans are a great place to be considering. But the lack of information and how we perhaps account for carbon that's absorbed by the oceans needs some more work on it as well. So people may not realize, but the oceans actually are what really controls the temperature within the world. So the oceans have absorbed around 30% of carbon emissions, that have occurred, man-made carbon emissions. They control the temperatures and the temperature distribution around the world. It's absorbed around 90% of the heat, the excess heat that we see through the greenhouse effect. So whenever we start to look at the green economy and how we can transition towards net zero, we really need to also think about the blue economy, because the oceans are such an important driver of any changes. And in fact, there are two fluid systems on the planet Earth. We have the atmosphere, which I think people are very familiar with when thinking about carbon emissions, but then you have the oceans and the water system.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that unfortunately I think is forgotten when you're comparing. Everyone's focused on what we do. We're technically really animals that live on land, so we're focused on what's around us. We can see the impacts we're having, but given the majority of the world is a water-based, it's something that is forgotten. I mean, how can we ensure, do you think, that the oceans are a more central part of efforts to tackle climate change then, and in turn, protect and enhance biodiversity?
So partly, I think we need to take a broader perspective, and this is the beauty of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in that they don't say focus only on climate change or carbon. I mean, you've got climate action as one of them, but SDG 14, life below water, is one of the goals, but you do need to take that very broad perspective. When people talk about ESG, I don't think they're usually thinking about the blue part of the E. And so I think it needs to start to become a more natural response to think of, okay, land-based solutions or problems, but also ocean-based solutions and problems. Governance is another issue, as if we don't have enough challenges with what's happening on land, the oceans haven't had an integrated system for governance. So most coastal states, if you have a border with the water, you have your territorial zone, but then you have what's called the high seas, so the deep water, and really the governance of the high seas. There have been some rules and regulations, but it hasn't been strong enough. And so only a week and a half ago now, a treaty was agreed at the UN in principle, which is a treaty to govern the high seas. And so that's going to cover, once we have member states sign up to the treaty, the setting up of marine protected areas, but also how we look at environmental impact assessments, sharing of data of impact assessments, how we can fairly and equitably share marine genetic resources. So a number of fundamental governance issues that we'll need if we start to think about the blue economy the same way we think about the green economy.
The High Seas Agreement, which you've just mentioned there, can you explain the implications of that, how it could change the way the oceans are being viewed, but also how has that impacted your research? And would you mind touching a little bit more on what you're looking to uncover at the moment?
So the High Seas Treaty is very important because we do need governance in place if we start to look at some of the critical issues that are emerging. And if I take an example of, say, transition, so we'll need more infrastructure if we need more solar, more wind farms, more turbines. There are what's called transition critical minerals, and this is a topic that the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics has been doing some really interesting work on. Now, some of those minerals are actually under the water, so we're going to need deep sea mining. But then we need to start to consider who owns these lands. So if it's outside of the exclusive economic zone of particular countries, who will own the area of the sea that we're going to start mining? What are the impacts on other parts of the ocean economy? So on fishing or tourism, for example. How do we really assess those impacts? And then how do you start to have the balance between what is more critical? Do we need to conserve the biodiversity in the oceans, or do we need those transition critical minerals? And so this is an area that I'm really starting to look at from a research perspective of how do you balance competing priorities, and with the speed that we're going to need to make transition towards net zero, what is the framework and that governance framework for assessing impacts and priorities?
And in terms of obviously linking back to that agreement based in the UN, wanted to see really from your point of view, why do you think that the 14th SDG has been kind of the least funded out of all 17 when it focuses on marine wildlife specifically?
So I go back to my experience with Thai Union, and at the end of my time there, we were looking at sustainable finance, so particularly a sustainability-linked loan. And speaking with different investors and financial institutions, there was what I would call a lack of ocean literacy. So when I was explaining different work to do with electronic monitoring systems at sea, or perhaps species conservation through fishery improvement projects, these were all terms that are familiar to people who work in the ocean space, but not necessarily to the financial sector. And so I do think that lack of ocean literacy is partly why there hasn't been more funding going into SDG 14, because people can't assess the risks. And any financial product, they need to understand the risks, but also the impacts and the opportunities. So there is something that we need to work on. How do you better understand the risks and the impacts, and how do you improve ocean literacy? And then I would go back to, I guess, the conversation that we were having previously, which is that people mainly think about land-based. So if you were thinking of how to, let's say, offset carbon emissions and the nature-based solutions, most people's minds immediately go to trees or green activities. And yet we know now that mangroves actually store far more carbon than terrestrial trees. We know the value from a biodiversity perspective of seagrass beds, of coral reefs. And so we're starting to see, particularly from the nature-based solutions, the importance of the oceans.
I think as well with what you've just said, from a UK perspective, we've actually seen recently there has been quite a lot of, it is very recent really, the last sort of 3-4 months, there's been some policies of trying to protect seagrass in Wales and places like that around the UK. So we've definitely seen it here as well, that change. Just sort of to conclude, do you see kind of any emerging innovations in blue finance? How do you think they could be used to help mitigate climate change, build resilience? And what are your hopes for the future in what this blue economy can achieve and where it can go, really?
I do see some emergent innovations in blue finance. And one example I would give would be from the insurance sector. So there was an example of an insurance, I think it might have been looking more towards the bonds, but they were looking at the value of mangroves for coastal protection. So really thinking about resilience and adaptation, and that the value of the mangroves for providing coastal protection was actually much more significant than if you were to build a, let's say, a concrete wall to protect a particular coastal zone. And so that interest in insurance and adaptation, and then how can you use a nature-based solution, is a really interesting innovation. We've also seen some sovereign blue bonds be issued where there is a debt swap for nature. There have been a few island states who've gone down that path. So I think there's emerging really interesting, innovative practice, but there's certainly a room for a lot more.
And finally, where would people need to go if they wanted to find out more about this or more about the research you're doing before we end?
So we'll be putting a few more explainers up on the GRI, the Grantham Research Institute website about the oceans. You'll see my commentary there, and you'll start to see some more research being placed up on that website. So I think that's a good first port of call.